And how do you expect to do that?
Oh, very easily. By leaving you here and destroying all means of transportation.
He was called the King of Hollywood, and for good reason. But behind the charm, the smile, and the effortless swagger, Clark Gable had a life full of stories that most people simply refused to believe. Until now. These are the Clark Gable stories no one believed, until they watched this. The ears nobody wanted to talk about. Clark Gable's ears were enormous. He knew it. Hollywood knew it. And for the first stretch of his career, the studios tried everything they could to minimize them. Camera angles, lighting tricks, hairstyling that drew the eye elsewhere. Louis B. Mayer at MGM reportedly took one look at Gable in the early 1930s and declared that audiences would never accept a leading man who looked like that. Gable's ears were so much a part of his early story that they nearly ended his career before it started. Irving Thalberg, MGM's head of production, initially passed on him for major roles. The argument was that his physical imperfections were too distracting for romantic leads. Gable kept working anyway, kept getting screen time in smaller roles, and eventually became impossible to ignore. The ears became part of the legend. There's something almost perfect about the fact that the feature Hollywood tried hardest to hide became one of the things audiences loved most about him. When you watch him in It Happened One Night or Gone with the Wind, the ears aren't a flaw. They're Clark Gable, the teeth he had pulled. In the early 1930s, Gable made a decision that would have most people wincing just hearing about it. He had several of his upper teeth extracted and replaced with dentures. The reason was practical. His teeth were in poor condition, and the dental work of the era offered limited solutions. Full dentures were, in some cases, the cleaner option. What makes this remarkable is what it cost him in an unexpected way. Claudette Colbert, his co-star in It Happened One Night in 1934, reportedly complained during production that when Gable leaned in close for intimate scenes, the dentures created an odor problem. She has been quoted over the years as saying that kissing Gable was not the romantic experience audiences might have imagined. Gable was aware of this. He was not particularly vain about it, by most accounts. He acknowledged his dental situation as a simple fact of his life, kept his sense of humor about it, and went on being Clark Gable. But it is one of those details that the carefully maintained studio image was never going to volunteer. The father who abandoned him. William Henry Gable, Clark's father, was an oil driller from Ohio who had little patience for his son's interest in performing. When Clark was still a teenager and beginning to find his way toward the theater, his father made his contempt for that ambition consistently clear. He wanted his son to work with his hands, to do something physical and concrete. The theater was not that. Clark was born on February 1st, 1901, in Cadiz, Ohio. His mother, Adeline, died of a brain tumor when he was just 7 months old. His father remarried, and his stepmother Jenny was by most accounts a genuinely warm woman who tried to give Clark the affection his father couldn't manage. But she died when Clark was 12, leaving him again with a father who had never found a way to connect with a boy who wasn't made in his image. Clark spent years chasing his father's approval. He worked the oil fields as a young man, genuine back-breaking labor, partly to demonstrate that he could do what his father respected. It didn't change much between them. When Clark eventually left for the theater, William Gable treated it as a permanent disappointment. Even after Clark became one of the most famous men in the world, his relationship with his father remained strained and formal. William Gable died in 1948, and the estrangement between them had never properly healed. Clark rarely spoke about it in interviews, which was consistent with the stoic public face he presented on nearly everything personal. But the people close to him knew the wound was there and had never fully closed. The acting teacher who changed everything. When Gable was a young man working odd jobs and trying to find his footing, he fell into the orbit of a drama teacher named Josephine Dillon. She was 14 years older than him, and she saw something in him that almost no one else had articulated yet. She took him on as a student, coached him in voice and movement and presence, and helped him understand how to use himself on stage in a way that would hold an audience. They married in 1924. Gable was 23. She was 37. It was by most accounts more a professional partnership than a passionate romance, though the line between the two is hard to draw cleanly when one person is pouring that much into the other's formation. Josephine invested enormous time, money, and energy into building Gable into a professional actor. She coached his voice, which was naturally strong but needed control and placement for the stage. She worked on his physicality, how he moved, how he held space, how he used silence. She introduced him to people in the theater world in Portland and Los Angeles who opened doors that would otherwise have stayed shut. When Gable's career began to rise and he moved on, personally and professionally, Josephine was left behind. He divorced her in 1930 to marry Rhea Langham, a wealthy Texas socialite. Josephine spent the rest of her life giving acting lessons and watching the man she had built become the biggest star in the world. She died in 1971. She never fully faded from his story, even as his story left her behind. Her name doesn't appear much in the popular mythology of Clark Gable. It probably should. The second wife he married for money. Rhea Langham was 17 years older than Gable and considerably wealthier. When he married her in 1930, his career was ascending, but not yet what it would become. Rhea had connections, resources, and a social world that Gable could move through as he built his position in Hollywood. It would be uncharitable to say the marriage was purely transactional. The people around them at the time suggested there was genuine affection, but it was also the kind of marriage that made practical sense in ways that romantic marriages don't always. Rhea helped him navigate a world that was still unfamiliar to a kid from Ohio who'd grown up without much. By the time Gable's career had fully taken off, the marriage had cooled significantly. When he fell in love with Carole Lombard in the late 1930s, the question was not whether he would leave, it was how and when. Rhea negotiated a divorce settlement that was substantial. She was not naive about what the marriage had been, and she made sure she was compensated accordingly. The film that almost destroyed his career, Dancing Lady in 1933 was fine. Hold Your Man in 1933 was fine. But before any of those, before the string of hits that made Gable MGM's most valuable male asset, there was a period where the studio genuinely considered dropping him. His screen test results were mixed. Some executives saw it, others didn't. The film that changed the conversation entirely was It Happened One Night in 1934, but what most people don't know is that Gable didn't want to make it. MGM loaned him out to Columbia Pictures, a smaller studio considered a step down, as what some accounts describe as a form of punishment. Gable had been difficult. He'd pushed back on roles. Lending him to Columbia was the studio's way of reminding him of his position. He reported to the Columbia lot unhappy about the assignment. Director Frank Capra met a man who was not particularly invested in what they were about to make. Claudette Colbert, cast opposite him, was equally unenthusiastic. She had to be persuaded to take the role and was already planning a vacation. It Happened One Night won 5 Academy Awards, including Best Picture, Best Director, Best Actor for Gable, and Best Actress for Colbert. It remains one of the most celebrated comedies in American film history. It was a punishment assignment that neither of them wanted. That doesn't happen often. The Oscar he didn't expect. When Gable won the Academy Award for Best Actor for It Happened One Night in 1935, the ceremony was held on February 27th at the Biltmore Hotel in Los Angeles. He went to the event without expecting to win. He had been nominated, but the competition was serious, and Gable was not someone who spent much time in earnest anticipation of recognition. When his name was called, he walked to the stage and gave one of the more unguarded acceptance speeches the ceremony had seen. He was visibly surprised and said so. There was no prepared speech, no careful list of thank yous. He said a few honest sentences, held the award, and sat back down. What's interesting is how little he talked about it afterward. The Oscar was real, and the achievement was real, but Gable was not someone who displayed his trophies prominently or referenced his awards in interviews as a way of establishing his value. Some of his contemporaries treated their Oscar as the central fact of their career. For Gable, it was one chapter in a much larger story. The undershirt that changed American fashion. In It Happened. One night, there is a brief scene in which Gable removes his outer shirt to reveal nothing underneath, no undershirt, just Clark Gable. The undershirt industry in America reportedly took an immediate hit. Sales dropped noticeably in the months following the film's release because men across the country were suddenly reconsidering whether undershirts were necessary at all. If Clark Gable didn't wear one, the logic went, perhaps neither should they. Whether the drop in undershirt sales is entirely attributable to one scene in one film is debatable. The clothing industry at the time had no mechanism for tracking cause and effect that precisely, but the story persisted, got repeated in trade publications, and eventually became one of those Hollywood anecdotes that sits right at the border between legend and documented fact. Gable himself found the whole thing amusing. He reportedly said he had no idea he was making a statement about undergarments. He was just taking his shirt off. The love of his life. Carole Lombard was everything. That's the simple version of the story, and it happens to be the true one. When Clark Gable and Carole Lombard met in the late 1930s, both were already established stars. She was sharper, funnier, and more grounded than almost anyone else in their world. She called him Pa, he called her Ma. They were, by every account from people who knew them, genuinely happy in a business that didn't produce that outcome reliably. They married on March 29, 1939, and moved to a ranch in Encino that Gable bought for them. It was, by the standards of their era and their business, an unusually private and stable domestic life. Lombard had no patience for Hollywood pretension. She cut through it with a directness that Gable found completely disarming, and she kept him honest in ways that no one else around him managed. She was also, it should be said, one of the most gifted comic actresses of the 1930s. Nothing Sacred in 1937, My Man Godfrey in 1936. She was not simply Clark Gable's wife. She was her own star, and their relationship was between equals, which was unusual in Hollywood marriages of the era, and which Gable valued more than he often said publicly. On January 16, 1942, Lombard boarded TWA Flight 3 in Indianapolis after a highly successful war bonds tour. She had raised over $2 million in a single day, a record at the time, and was eager to get home. The plane crashed into Mount Potosi in the Spring Mountains southeast of Las Vegas, Nevada, killing everyone on board. She was 33 years old. Gable received the news while he was at the ranch in Encino. He drove immediately to Las Vegas and then tried to get to the crash site. The wreckage was not accessible. He stood at the base of the mountain, and the people with him said he was unlike anything they had seen from him before or after. He enlisted in the United States Army Air Forces shortly after, in August 1942. He was 41 years old, well past the age of required service. He flew combat missions over Europe. The people who served with him said he seemed like someone who was not particularly concerned about whether he came home. The missions over Europe. Clark Gable served as a gunnery officer with the 351st Bombardment Group based at Polebrook in Northamptonshire, England. He flew at least 5 combat missions over occupied Europe between 1943 and 1944, including missions over Germany and occupied France at a time when American bomber losses over Europe were severe. The 8th Air Force was losing crews at a rate that made each mission statistically dangerous. These were not ceremonial assignments arranged to generate favorable publicity. He flew in B-17 Flying Fortresses on actual bombing runs. Planes in his formation were hit. Men around him did not come back. He was trained as a gunner and put to work as one. There were reports at the time, and the story has persisted in military history accounts, that Adolf Hitler had reportedly offered a substantial reward for Gable's capture, wanting him alive for propaganda purposes. The idea of parading the King of Hollywood as a prisoner had obvious appeal to the Nazi propaganda machine. Whether Hitler personally issued a specific order to that effect is not definitively established in documentation that has survived, but the story was taken seriously enough by American military authorities that there was genuine concern at command level about what his capture or death might mean. General Hap Arnold, the commanding general of the Army Air Forces, reportedly expressed concern multiple times about the wisdom of putting one of America's most famous faces into active combat. Gable didn't much want to hear it. He was discharged in June 1944 with the rank of Major and was awarded the Air Medal and the Distinguished Flying Cross. He returned to Hollywood looking older, noticeably thinner, and by multiple accounts without the lightness he had carried before the war. Some people who knew him before and after said they never quite got the same man back. The Secret Daughter. This is the story that took the longest to be told fully and honestly. In 1935, Clark Gable and Loretta Young were cast together in The Call of the Wild, filmed largely on location in the Pacific Northwest. What happened during that production has been described in various ways over the decades, with the full picture only emerging decades later. Loretta Young returned from the production and, several months afterward, quietly disappeared. She checked into a private home in Venice, California, and gave birth to a daughter in November 1935. The baby was named Judith. Young then arranged a private adoption and in 1937 officially adopted Judith herself, presenting her publicly as a child she had adopted from an orphanage. Gable was the father. Young never named him publicly during his lifetime or hers for many years. The secret was maintained through an elaborate fiction that required the cooperation of Young's family, her studio, and the people immediately around her. Judith, later Judy Lewis, grew up not knowing who her father was. The large, slightly prominent ears she inherited were a feature she lived with without understanding their origin. She was a teenager before she began to suspect the truth, and an adult before the full picture came into focus. She wrote her memoir, Uncommon Knowledge, published in 1994, and addressed the story directly. She described a childhood haunted by a secret she couldn't name and an identity shaped around something no one would explain to her. Loretta Young, in her later years, acknowledged what had happened without ever providing complete detail. She died in 2000, having never fully made peace with it publicly. Gable never acknowledged Judy Lewis. He died in November 1960, a month after completing The Misfits. He left behind a child he had never claimed. The superstition about Gone with the Wind. By the time production began on Gone with the Wind in late 1938, the project was already the most anticipated film in American cinema. David O. Selznick's search for the actress to play Scarlett O'Hara had consumed the press for over 2 years. Everyone knew who Rhett Butler was going to be. Everyone except Gable, who was doing everything he could to make sure it wasn't him. Gable didn't want the role. He said so, repeatedly, and not quietly. His concern was specific. Margaret Mitchell's novel had created an image of Rhett Butler in millions of readers' minds, and Gable was convinced that no performance he could give would satisfy that expectation. He was going to disappoint people. He felt that with some certainty, and it was one of the rare occasions when he let anxiety show. He was also, by his own account, intimidated by Gone with the Wind in a way he wasn't usually intimidated by anything. This was not false modesty from a man who had won an Oscar and topped box office charts for years. He genuinely felt the weight of what was being asked, and he genuinely didn't want it. Louis B. Mayer negotiated his participation as part of a deal that gave MGM distribution rights to the film in exchange for releasing Gable for the production and providing a portion of the financing. Gable went, under effective contractual compulsion. He gave one of the defining performances in American film history. The ending, the line about frankly not giving a damn, is one of the most quoted moments in cinema. He was not nominated for an Academy Award for the performance. Vivien Leigh won Best Actress. Hattie McDaniel became the first black performer to win an Academy Award for her supporting role as Mammy. Olivia de Havilland was nominated. Gable said afterward that he felt the film had gone to the women in it and that this was right. Coming from someone who had spent most of the previous decade as the biggest male star in Hollywood, that was a gracious thing to say. The moment he made Marilyn Monroe cry. The Misfits, written by Arthur Miller and released in 1961, was Clark Gable's last film. It was also Marilyn Monroe's last completed film. The production gathered in the Nevada desert in the summer of 1960, and almost immediately it became clear that what was assembled there was something close to a controlled disaster. Monroe was late constantly, sometimes by hours, occasionally by most of the day. She was visibly struggling with the kind of difficulty that goes beyond professional behavior into something that clearly requires help. Director John Huston was managing the chaos as best he could while also managing his own appetites, which were considerable. Arthur Miller, Monroe's husband at the time and the man who had written the film specifically for her, was watching his marriage collapse in public on the set he'd created. Gable, by multiple crew accounts, was patient with Monroe in a way that surprised people who knew him professionally. He was not someone who easily tolerated unprofessionalism. He was a man who had built a career on showing up and being ready. And by every objective measure, Monroe's behavior on that set was professionally difficult. The production ran well over schedule. The Nevada heat was brutal. The physical work was genuinely demanding, but he treated her gently. He waited. He showed up when he was supposed to, was ready when she finally arrived, and gave her the scenes she needed without making her feel the weight of what her delays had cost everyone. After the production wrapped, Monroe reportedly said that Gable was the only man on that set who treated her with consistent kindness. She said he reminded her of the father she never had. She had grown up without a father in her life, shuttled through foster homes and the care of others, and Gable's combination of patience and masculine steadiness was something she responded to in a way she didn't entirely have words for. Gable completed the film and returned to California. He had been doing his own stunts throughout the production, roping and being dragged by horses across the Nevada desert floor, despite being 59 years old and despite repeated pleas from the production to use a stunt double. He had a heart attack on November 6, 1960, 11 days after wrapping. He died on November 16, 1960. Monroe, upon hearing the news, was devastated. She blamed herself. She felt that the delays she had caused had extended the production and extended extended Gable's physical exposure to the punishing work in the Nevada heat. His widow, Kay Spreckels Gable, later attributed Gable's death in part to the accumulated stress of the production. Whether that is entirely fair is a question with more than one honest answer, but Monroe carried it. The child he never knew. Clark Gable died on November 16, 1960. 4 months later, on March 20, 1961, his son John Clark Gable was born. Kay Spreckels, who had been pregnant when Gable died, gave birth to the only biological child Gable had formally acknowledged. John Clark Gable grew up knowing his father entirely through film, photographs, and the accounts of people who had known him. He became an actor himself, and the resemblance to his father, the bone structure, the ears, the bearing, made every interview a conversation about inheritance and legacy. The story of John's birth coming 4 months after his father's death is one of those biographical facts that doesn't lose its weight no matter how many times you hear it. Gable spent his adult life as one of the most recognized men in the world, and his son never had a single moment with him, the racially charged casting decision he fought. In the years following World War II, as Gable was rebuilding his career and his personal life, he made several films that carried complicated racial undertones by the standards of any era. His position within the studio system, and within Hollywood's social hierarchy, meant that he had access to information and decisions that most performers didn't. What is documented is that Gable, on more than one occasion, advocated for the treatment of black performers on his productions in ways that were unusual for a white star of his era. He reportedly insisted on treating the cast and crew around him equally regardless of race at a time when segregation was still a common feature of film production. These were not dramatic public gestures. They were quiet professional standards he applied to his own immediate environment. He was not an activist. He was not ahead of his time in ways that would read as progressive by later standards, but the accounts from black crew members and supporting performers who worked with him are consistently warmer than the accounts from those who worked with many of his contemporaries. The night at the crash site. In the immediate aftermath of Carole Lombard's death, Gable went to Nevada and could not reach the wreckage. TWA Flight 3 had struck Table Rock on the southern face of Mount Potosi at an elevation of approximately 7,770 feet. The terrain was steep, the wreckage was scattered, and the site was not accessible on foot in the first hours. What he did at the base of the mountain that night is not extensively documented because he was not someone who shared his grief publicly, and there were no reporters present. What is known is that he had to be gently persuaded to leave the area by the people accompanying him. He was not ready to accept what had happened. The crash had killed 22 people in total. Lombard, her mother Bessie Peters, and her press agent Otto Winkler among the passengers, along with Army Air Forces personnel who had boarded the flight and the flight crew. Recovery teams reached the site in the days following, but what was recovered was fragmentary. The mountain had been decisive. Gable returned to California. He sat in the house in Encino that he and Lombard had built together, and the accounts from people around him describe a silence that lasted weeks. Some of her personal belongings, clothing, correspondence, small objects, were eventually recovered from the site and returned to him. He kept her things at the ranch for the rest of his life. After his death, the ranch was sold. Some of her belongings were eventually scattered. The ranch itself changed hands multiple times and was ultimately subdivided. A high school was built on part of what had been their property. The house itself was demolished. The life they had built there, which had been so deliberately private and ordinary by Hollywood standards, exists now only in the accounts of people who had seen it. The transformation after the war. When Gable returned from his service in the Army Air Forces in 1944, he was 43 years old. He had lost Carole Lombard. He had flown combat missions over Germany. He had watched men die. He had, by the accounts of people who knew him before and after, come back as someone who had been fundamentally altered by the preceding 3 years. He went back to work at MGM, and the studio wasn't entirely sure what to do with him. The Gable who had made It Happened One Night and Mutiny on the Bounty in the 1930s had a buoyancy to him. He could be roguish and playful. The post-war Gable was still commanding and still watchable, but the lightness had shifted into something more deliberate. more considered. His work in the late 1940s reflects this. Adventure in 1945, The Hucksters in 1947, Command Decision in 1948. The performances are technically accomplished, but they carry a weight that the earlier work didn't have in the same way. The critics noticed it. Some found it deeper, some found it heavier than the material warranted. His friend and colleague Jimmy Stewart observed something similar in himself after his own wartime service. Stewart had flown 20 combat missions over Europe as a bomber pilot and came back to Hollywood haunted in ways that shaped every performance he gave afterward. The war had taken men who were accustomed to performing a version of uncomplicated masculine confidence and given them experiences that made that performance harder to sustain without acknowledging what was underneath it. Gable married twice more after the war, to Sylvia Ashley in 1949, which lasted only a few years, and to Kay Spreckles in 1955. Neither marriage carried the quality of what he'd had with Lombard, and he didn't pretend otherwise to the people who knew him. The day he turned down the Godfather role. This story circulates in Hollywood history, with enough repetition to have become a standard piece of the Gable mythology, so it requires some care. The version that most people have heard is that Gable was offered the role of Don Corleone in The Godfather and turned it down. That is not possible. The Godfather was released in 1972. Gable died in 1960. The film was not in development, and Mario Puzo had not yet written the novel. What is documented is that Gable turned down a number of major roles throughout his career for various reasons. Sometimes because he didn't connect with the material, sometimes because he was managing his image carefully, and sometimes simply because he didn't feel like doing them. The specific roles vary by source. The point is that his career choices were his own to a degree that was unusual for a studio contract actor of his era. What the Godfather anecdote tells you, even in its inaccurate form, is that Gable's name has remained so synonymous with a particular kind of American masculine authority that people reach for him when they're trying to imagine who else might have owned a legendary role. That's its own kind of legacy. The ranch he never left. The property in Encino that Gable bought in 1939 as a home for himself and Carole Lombard was 20 acres of orange and walnut trees, a barn, and a modest house by Hollywood standards. They called it the ranch, and they meant it. They kept chickens and horses and tended the land and lived in a way that was genuinely removed from the Hollywood social circuit that consumed most of their contemporaries. Other stars of their era kept estates designed to impress visitors. Gable and Lombard kept a working farm. They got their hands dirty. They ate what they grew. Lombard reportedly insisted on it. She had no interest in a life performed for the benefit of columnists and party guests, and the Encino Ranch was their declaration of that preference. After Lombard's death, Gable stayed. He could have sold the property, moved somewhere that didn't carry the weight of everything it represented. He didn't. He stayed for over 20 years. He was working on the property, doing the physical maintenance himself, moving around the land he'd shared with her, on the day he had the heart attack that killed him. The ranch passed to his estate and eventually to Kay Spreckles, his fifth wife, and their son John Clark Gable. It was sold in the years after his death, subdivided as the San Fernando Valley expanded around it. A high school now sits on part of what was their land. The house was demolished. The orange and walnut trees are gone. There is something fitting about it, and something sad. The most private, most honest chapter of Clark Gable's life. The one where he was most himself, least performing, least the king of Hollywood, and most just a man who loved a woman and had a piece of land and wanted to keep it simple, is the chapter that left the least behind. The movie's last. The ranch is gone. Clark Gable was the king of Hollywood for over 3 decades, and the title was earned honestly. He showed up, did the work, and let the performances speak. He came from nothing, a small town in Ohio, a father who didn't believe in him, a mother he never knew, and built something that still holds 65 years after his death. What the performances couldn't say, the grief, the distance from his father, the daughter he never acknowledged, the son he never met, the woman he lost on a Nevada mountain and never fully recovered from, lived in the spaces between the scenes. The stories about him that people didn't believe, or didn't want to believe, or simply hadn't heard yet, are the ones that make him a real person rather than a photograph. The real person is more interesting than the photograph. It almost always is. These were the Clark Gable stories no one believed, until they watched this. If this video gave you something to think about, hit that like button and subscribe. There's more Hollywood history waiting for you.